Awesome. So we've finally reached the point where we can put together all the findings of all things Nonprofit Management Institute for the center for the past summer. So over the course of the summer, I've worked on creating a survey just to gauge the impact of the Nonprofit Management Institute post-graduation, reaching out to both the fall cohort and the spring cohort. So just going to cover a little bit of the survey population and background information of the survey and the participants. The survey was conducted using SurveyMonkey and was sent to all NPMI graduates. Of the NPMI graduates, we had a total of 9 participants. 3 participants belong to the fall 2020 cohort and 6 of the participants belonging to the spring 21 cohort. The vast majority of respondents chose to remain anonymous, and those that did not remain anonymous actually ended up being those participants that expressed an interest in doing the follow-up interview. And a little bit of background about the participants, much more broad strokes. So those that participated, their roles in their organizations range a good bit. We have executive directors, wellness directors, president, CEO, director of programs, board chair, and director of lending as well. So interesting to see the variety of, who's participating in NPMI. So these are background information questions. I will say the structure of the presentation and the findings follows the structure of the survey. I thought it would be best to sort of keep that structure and make the most sense out of it that way, looking back and forth between the raw data and then the summary. So we'll start off with some background information. First and foremost, how many members make up your board of directors? The vast majority of participants, I will say. So when I say the vast majority, I mean of participants rather than the vast majority of NPMI participants because of the low survey response. But the vast majority of participants noted that they have anywhere from 6 to 10 board members. I do have an asterisk here. I wanted to make sure to point out that there was one participant that noted that they had 14 to 16 members on their boards. There was some variance in that, but for data visualization purposes, I went ahead and counted them as 15.
Can I ask a quick question, April?
Yes.
How many total surveys went out? Do you remember? Roughly.
Rebecca, do you remember how many people were on that? I know there was the additional 8 that we had to send it to.
Yeah, so 9 out of it ended up being a little over 100, right?
I have it written down, actually, I can tell you.
But that could be a rough number. So roughly 100-ish.
So about 10% for response rate, maybe a little less. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's all I want.
Yeah, I don't see the
That's fine.
concrete number.
I could just, since someone's going to ask that question, so I just wanted to.
Yeah,
it was a good question.
It was around 100, so we got about 10%.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay, and then, we were also trying to gauge BIPOC within all of this. And so approximately what percentage of the board identifies as BIPOC? Pretty good to see that, it's sort of like a bell curve going on here, which is pretty interesting. 3 organizations have, 26 to 50% of their board being BIPOC, and then 3 have, 1 to 25%. It is great to see that, 2 organizations are much more BIPOC forward, and they have 51 to 75% of their board identifying as BIPOC. And then for those that participated in this survey, 6 of them identified as the leader of their organization, and 3 of them did not. And that's where you see, the board director, the director of lending, and then the wellness director in there as well. A little bit of demographics on the leaders of the organizations. So this question was showed to individuals that marked identifying as the leader of their organization. 4 of those identified as white or Caucasian, and 2 of them identified as African American or Black. For those that marked that they were not the leader of their organization, we asked that they, to the best of their knowledge, identify or sort of express how their leader identifies. And to their knowledge, their organization leader identified as white or Caucasian. Impact and implementation post-graduation. This section sort of asked about the 5 different sessions, and we asked them to rank on a scale. So we gave them a sliding scale, and then we had optional text boxes if they wanted to provide more information about the sessions. And so the first one was orientation, capacity assessment, and nonprofit management. And this is just the rating of the impact from what they learned from the session post-graduation, 1 being little to no impact and 5 being a significant impact. The 1 to 5 was then translated on a scale from 0 to 100. And then so here you have all the respondents and how they scored this session. I did want to point out that with the way that SurveyMonkey gives back the data, it's not that each individual respondent was given a number and like their respondent 1, respondent 2, respondent 3. So they were randomized in this to sort of protect for the anonymity that they asked for. And so the vast majority of them did have a positive experience with this. There's that 1 outlier of a score of 48, but that leads me to believe, maybe they knew a lot going into it beforehand, just based off of what we got fresh out of the sessions with the evaluations. The average session score was an 80. We got a little bit of feedback from this one. Participants said it would have been nice if they had taken it with other staff members of their organization so that they could sort of debrief and pick each other's brains, which I thought was interesting. And then some of the practices that have been implemented with respect to this session topic, a lot of strategic planning, board training, development strategies, running a capacity assessment and adding the necessary functionality for that, understanding the organization's strengths and limitations, sharing with the board of directors that the program was completed by this individual, and then closely reviewing the assessment with their team to better assess and understand strengths and weaknesses. So I think the large takeaway from this is having more people within the organization participate so that they can increase the impact of it, which is cool to see because there was still positive feedback on their impact alone. The second topic session was board governance and program design, as well as management and evaluation. The overall session score ratings ranged a bit more for this session. We had a couple in the 50s, but we also had 2 100s. And so that was interesting to see the variation within that. And the overall session score for this one was a 73. The elaboration for this one is that, one of the organizations was currently trying to work through board governance. In particular, they sort of described it as the Great Resignation, having a lot of issues with keeping board members on and turnover within the board. And so, that was particularly helpful for this organization because they were able to learn about board governance while they were, working through it on their own. And then some of the best practices that were since implemented because of the session and NPMI as a whole, just using those board recruitment, board policies, and logic models so that they can develop a program design and proper evaluation for what their organization is doing, as well as taking some of the tools that they learned and strategies for asking good questions. And then also having monthly check-ins with board members and updating their programming surveys to ask more qualitative questions. So I thought that was interesting. They found it very helpful for a lot of evaluation purposes and board governance and a little bit of program design in there as well.
It's going to be interesting this time around when we separate the two, because it sounds like they want more time with board governance than program, not rather than, but I think they would like a deeper dive into board governance, it sounds like.
I agree, and you'll see that even more overwhelmingly when we get to the interviews. Even though it was only 3 interviews, you'll see why that's going to be very important. But for strategic planning, this session overall, overwhelmingly good responses to this. We got 2 100s, and then the lowest score was a 60. So definitely bringing that back up with strategic planning. The average score was a 70. And one participant chose to sort of elaborate on the score that they gave, and they noted that they're at the point where they need to revise their strategic plan. And that's just based off of the current capacity and expertise of the board, which, it's great to acknowledge that you have to tailor things to the board sometimes to be able to uplift and move forward. Some of the practices that were implemented because of the session, I started working on steps for strategic planning, which is pretty cool to see. Developing a 1-year stopgap strategic plan while the board is new until they can, get a full strategic plan up and running. Another organization noted that they've been engaged in strategic planning over the past year and are now working on a sustainability plan, which is also awesome to see, because you want to make sure not only are you, getting it done, but making sure that it's going to last into the future. And then another organization noted that they need to review the practices to make sure that they're, doing things and doing them as effectively as possible. With respect to fundraising and financial management, a bit more variation in the score here. The low was a 49 and then high was 100. So I think this just goes to show it sort of depends on where you are when you go in and how much it's going to impact you on the other end. But even then, there was a lot of good positive feedback. Average score for this one was a bit lower, was a 70. No one wanted to elaborate on the score that they gave, which is fine, because we had a lot of feedback on what they've implemented, on the back end of things. So we've developed a fundraising plan and strategies to improve fiscal infrastructure. We've developed financial policy,
Firing that's what I'm laughing at.
creating financial statements, going through an external audit, purchasing a donor database system. Something tells me that should say hiring, but we'll see about that. Because that could be a good thing either way, honestly. They have strong fiscal strategies in place. Fundraising and development need continued focus, and then also taking more time to get to know their donors on a one-to-one basis, which I think is a really good thing. Also increasing awareness by having organizations provide financial scholarships for team members. So a lot going on with fundraising and financial management here. And then the final session also had a good bit of variance in here, keeping in mind that we're asking them to evaluate a topic as well as a ceremony. So the lower score here was a 50, but then we still had a 100 in the end. Average here was a 72. We had no elaboration on scores given, but once again, we did have some pretty good substantial feedback on practices that have been implemented on the back end of things. The employee manual was updated. A lot of work on onboarding processes and diversity, equity, and inclusion. It was difficult for one organization because they're the only employee and work under contract. Another organization noted that it's good to get additional information around this because the pandemic has been a significant factor in operations, which we know in large part is true for a lot of nonprofits right now and, the past year. So noting that their people are what keep the organization moving forward, which is really awesome to see. And then the impact of volunteers we see here, they're seeing the importance of how important it is to be clear and provide ongoing training to make sure that engagement is still a thing and making sure that adequate access to support and resources is given so that they can, continue to push forward, can't fill others' cups unless your own cup is full. So that was pretty interesting to see there. And then we have a sort of overview of the average session rating, sort of to put it in perspective. And so I think you can see across the board, pretty consistent. I would say very good. And then again, bearing in mind that, we do have a variety of new leaders, emerging leaders, and experienced leaders. And so that's also going to play a role in the overall session scores. Additional support. We asked if any additional support would be helpful, and if so, what additional support? There was a lot of interest in monthly or quarterly newsletter, as well as interest in additional resources and materials on a specific principle or topic that was covered in NPMI. We were expecting there to be a lot more interest in a Facebook group or some sort of networking platform, just because of the overwhelming feedback we got about having a networking platform after the session evaluations. So interesting to see that only one individual expressed interest in that. Does it mean it's something that should not happen? Not necessarily, but it is nonetheless interesting to sort of see. And then again, it goes to show that, we got a 10% response rate. So this doesn't necessarily capture the needs of all NPMI graduates as a whole. And then the follow-up. So one of the big things with the NPMI survey was hoping to do phone interviews to get a little bit more, hopefully anecdotal experiences and evidence and feedback from postgrads. And so we had 4 individuals say yes, they wanted to do a follow-up phone interview, and 6 individuals said no. As I noted before we started this presentation to Lisa and Rebecca, one of the individuals that expressed interest in participating in the survey chose to remain anonymous for the survey, which sort of, is the one that got away now, because the other 3 did not wish to remain anonymous. And so there was really no way to go about that. And then I will show you all the follow-up interviews and how those went. And so while that loads, perfect timing, I sort of followed the structure of the interviews and how they were conducted and used that to inform the layout of this. So it was just follow best. And so you'll see, with the first question, we've got the question and then we've got all of the answers. While we were hoping for, constructive feedback, I also wanted to include the positive feedback that was given, because it's always good to look at, the good and the what could be better. And so I asked them, to look back on their participation in the Institute and their experiences being a part of the cohort, and to sort of think if there was anything that could have made it more impactful or successful for them, be it personally or professionally. More opportunities for networking would be helpful, specifically having the opportunity to pair off with other organizations and individuals. I think this is an important note. Not necessarily, the breakout rooms were great, but if there was a specific opportunity for it to be sort of a smaller breakout and more focused, having longer sessions, this is also something that was, overwhelmingly expressed in the evaluations immediately following the first and second iterations of NPMI. Kind of along the same vein, each topic covering 2 sessions as opposed to 1. So a lot of people were saying that, it was great. We see, considering the circumstances, NPMI was great. We couldn't be in person because of COVID, but it was still phenomenal and very well done. But it would just be helpful in order to go more in depth with the content, to have it be longer or more sessions. So that was a lot of what we got back from that. Very consistent, in the interviews, as well as, like I said, with that post course evaluation. We also asked them if they felt as though any sessions were lacking, and if so, in what ways were they lacking? Specifically on the topic of finance, which this goes back and sort of explains a bit of the scoring with that session topic session. There wasn't enough depth to the topics, but specifically the finance topic. Another individual said that all of them were extremely knowledge packed and helpful. Another individual said that the sessions were engaging and enjoyable and in no way lacking at all. Again, just goes to show emerging leaders versus experienced, and the needs of their nonprofit at the given time and the struggles of their nonprofit at the given time. In terms of technical or logistical aspects of NPMI, we asked them if there's anything they would have changed, be it course time, duration, structure, level of difficulty, anything they could think of. Once again, it would have been helpful if the sessions were longer because there was not enough time to cover each topic. We also had a lot of positive feedback on this. It was really well organized. The handoff between presenters was great. And, with that, the presenter, Dr. Palmer, really knew her material and what she was doing. So they were very much appreciative of that. Also thinking about the day of the week that class was held on, noting that it was structured very well, and having class on Tuesday as opposed to Monday was really good. So I thought that was some interesting feedback there. We also asked them if they learned something useful, wonderful, and or important. And if that's the case, which we hoped it was, what is it that they were able to learn? And so board governance, we hear it again. Their organization happened to be working on it at the time. So it was extremely helpful for them to be going through it and working through it, and then having that reinforcement, with the Nonprofit Management Institute. Also noting that, while there wasn't specifically a session around diversity, equity, and inclusion, as this organization, calls it, it was still helpful for them to sort of work through the tidbits that were discussed with respect to EDI in the Institute, as they were also exploring that. The Principles and Practices Guide, very much loved and appreciated, noting that it was a gem to be able to go back and reference it, and is still a gem to be able to go back and reference. So kudos for the Principles and Practices Guide. And then lastly, we had one organization extremely appreciative because they were able to immediately apply what they were learning about board governance to combat the Great Resignation. As I mentioned earlier, not only in the past year have all sorts of organizations faced the issue with people resigning or being forced to resign, but there's also a lot of that on board of directors. And so turnover, the Great Resignation. So it was really helpful to be able to apply that and to help them to push forward and keep board members on and find new board members. The next 4 questions are a series of did the sessions. And so for the first one, did the sessions challenge you and others to think differently? With these questions, I didn't want it to be too firm. I gave them the option. You can say yes, you can say no, you can say yes and elaborate, or you can say no and elaborate. Really opening the floor for them to give any and all feedback that they wanted. And so we see, 2 participants said that it did challenge them and others to think differently. And for another participant, it was just making sure that they were on track and thinking through things as they should. So that was good to see, a lot of it's keeping me on track, which is, what you would hope. Did it encourage your discovery of new ideas and understandings? Yes, yes, and yes. All yeses across the board. Great feedback again. Did the sessions help you to see things you already knew, but in a new light? All yeses again here, but noting that it helped to fuel or refresh my mind. And lastly, did it provide you with opportunities to interact with and learn from others? Yes, yes, yes again. And then looking at our time post-graduation, asking once again if there are any additional supports, resources, offerings, anything that they could think of that would really help them move forward in their learning journey and mastery with the skills and practices and principles covered in NPMI. Again, we see the Facebook group return. So some sort of Facebook group or network to engage ad hoc. Another really interesting idea was a part 2 that goes more in depth on some topics. So, be it a refresher course, you'll see down at the very bottom, trainings to build upon NPMI, a sort of refresher. And so thought it was interesting to hear that, not necessarily is every organization going to be working through these topics at the time that they are going through NPMI. They might not get to one of the, for example, board governance. They might not be struggling with it at the time, or they might be trying to work on something else at the time. So, when they are finally able to go back to it and work on board governance, it'd be helpful if they could have a refresher. Something else that was also very interesting, and I think is definitely worth considering in the future of NPMI is, not only more iterations of NPMI, but sort of a part 1 and part 2 of NPMI. Part 1 covering the first 6 principles and part 2 covering the next 6. We had one individual who was hungry for more, so eager to, go over the next 6 principles beyond what's in the principles and practices guide.
That was my
Also,
idea.
sorry?
Is that I had that idea. Remember that, Rebecca?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. That was probably the most informative interview that I did have going into it. I told them it would take about 10 to 15 minutes. And I think this interview took roughly 30 minutes. Lots of great feedback. It was actually Arlene Brown. I think that name might come to mind. Expressed a lot of interest in doing whatever she can to help, whether it's advertising, pubbing things, partnering. So it's good to know that things are really going well with them. Some other additional supports and resources that might be helpful: a newsletter with updates on principles and practices. So maybe, not having a more in-depth version of these topics in a later on iteration, if you will, but just a newsletter with updates and more information on the principles and practices, sort of a condensed version of it. And then lastly, the opportunity to engage with the other cohort, which I thought was interesting. So, if we're looking into doing a Facebook group, maybe it's, we've got groups for the individual cohorts, and then we have a group for all NPMI participants. Not only, I would see it being important to create these beforehand. So not waiting until they've graduated, because a lot of feedback expressed, how helpful it would be to be able to work through and bounce ideas off of other organizations and other organization leaders in the process. And so that might be something to consider moving forward as well.
So that would be different than the idea of the Facebook group.
So it would be the same thing, but as opposed to having one Facebook group, or as opposed to having just one big Facebook group, or one Facebook group for the fall 2020 cohort and one Facebook group for the spring 2021, having one Facebook group for each individual cohort so they can, interact as they go through NPMI, and then also having a larger umbrella Facebook group where participants of all cohorts, past and to come, can sort of work through things together and also follow up after the fact and share what's gone well for them and seek out advice. They're primarily looking for the center to be sort of hub and provide them with the space for networking, and resource sharing was the large the piece in that they were really looking for.
Right, David.
And then asking Lastly, if there's any additional feedback that they wanted to offer that wasn't necessarily captured in any of the questions asked in the interview or the survey. They just wanted to note, while we did ask about the impact of NPMI, just felt very passionate about NPMI, noted that it's a must for new nonprofit leaders. So good to see that it's definitely very important, impactful institute. Also noting the structure was very helpful for keeping us on track. Having reading to do on their own before class and homework assignments, if you will, and having a sort of set time to sit down and do it was really helpful. This individual said that, had she had the materials to do it, but not had a structured time to sit through with the class, it might not have been as good. And I think, it's one of the things about how we function as human beings. It's always, I can't say always, but in most cases, it's helpful to have a structured time where we do something and we really give it our all and dive into it. And then how likely are you to recommend NPMI to your fellow colleagues? Hopefully you already have. And I apologize for whatever reason this did not load and keep with the formatting, but we are 100% likely to recommend it. We actually already have and are going to continue to, and we have been keeping an eye out for the next iterations that we can recommend our other team members participation in it. So a lot of positive feedback. And then just room for additional comments or ideas, like I said, opportunity to have a refresher on the first 6 principles, some sort of follow-up to discuss learnings and build upon them would be helpful. So this, might look like that Facebook group, might look like some sort of webinar or training ad hoc. And then finally, perhaps a continuation of NPMI covering the next 6 principles. So some of these were already mentioned in the questions that were asked previously, but I thought they were important to pull out and emphasize once again, because they were some pretty good ideas from my perspective. And that is what we've got, all things NPMI.
That's pretty good.
Great. April, as you were
Yes.
compiling the data and thinking about the future of this sort of follow-up survey, is there anything that you would change about it or tweak about it going forward, other than giving it out sooner after they complete the session, their last session?
So you're talking about specifically, I just want to make sure I understand the survey and okay.
The survey itself. And if you need time to think about it, that's okay too, because I'm kind of putting
I would
you on the
just say,
spot.
like, the first things that come to mind, which you sort of already mentioned, somehow trying to raise the participant percentage, the percentage of overall participants would be great. Because, there was a large body of feedback to work with in the post-session evaluations as opposed to this. And so maybe that means the timing, maybe because we did it in the summer, that played a role. Maybe having it open for longer. A lot of surveys have been going around in the past year, and so maybe people are just tired of surveys. So thinking about a way, how can we get more people to participate? Like you said, maybe that's just doing it more immediately after. But it is also good in a way to see and to have had that time, because it, they can say, this is what I hope to implement. And that's what they said in their post evaluation, fresh out of the sessions. These are the things I hope to implement and start doing. And now they've had time, so we can ask, did you actually implement the things you were wanting to implement? So maybe that looks like, they do their course in the fall, and then halfway through the spring course or at the end of the spring course, we reach back out to the fall participants and say, hey, how are things going? maybe that looks like a 3, 6, and 12-month check-in, or a 6-month after the fact check-in, so that they have time to do that. I do think that it was a little bit too much time. But if there was, I really think a 3, 6, and 12-month would be helpful. Now, obviously, it's for the center to decide whether it would be more work than it's worth, or just a little bit too much work in general. But I think that would really allow us to see the progression of the impacts of NPMI. It's also hard for people to recall, with everything that's been going on. It's a little bit hard to think back and recall, this is what I've done, but was this from NPMI? I can't remember. Did I start this before NPMI? Did I start after? What else could be a little
I
bit?
think timing is going to be a big thing. I think,
Timing
I
is
think,
huge.
yeah, I think that's going to be the big difference
Yeah.
of everything.
And
And
we
it's in,
will-
go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, please, I'll remember.
I was just going back on some of the notes I took. I said, it's just really interesting, some of their feedback, because I almost wonder, again, when they talk about this newsletter with updates on the PNP, what could that entail? And this, I'm almost thinking on the website, but I don't know if this would work. Like you have, now you have coffee at 2 or discussions. That's like, if we had a set time, problem is, and it would need to be monitored. It would be great if it didn't. And they just, anyone signed on and just, almost like we do our mingles session, but it's a PNP mingle session. But but the problem with that is, if you never know who's going to sign on, if only one person and nothing else, and it's at a waste of time,
Yeah.
right?
No.
So, or like, how could we do that without it being a dedicated, without putting out more questions like, can you sign on Tuesdays at 2 for a PNP mingle? Then we got to wait for the feedback, and I don't know if that's worth it. But anyway, I was just thinking about how that can be done.
Yeah, I mean, their feedback about having there was overwhelming feedback for like a newsletter that was with more resources and things like that, I think. And it makes me think of we have several newsletters that we send out. And so part of me almost thinks for the future, it might be a question of matching up, how many people said that they would want that are you getting our newsletters? Are you reading them? Could be sort of like a follow or a
So how many newsletters are there I know there's the policy and update.
policy, there's the members, there's a members only one, and then there's the training and professional development one. I think there's just three.
And so I think something to keep in mind with that, like you said, are they getting these newsletters or not? Are they members or not?
Right.
Arlene mentioned she is a member, and so she's able to really reap all the benefits of that. Another participant, I think it was Terry Albanese, and these people, they were fine with their names being shared. That's just not something that their nonprofit can work around in their budget at the time. Currently, being a member. So it's something that they're hopeful for. And so maybe that's a discussion around membership. Could there be sort of, is there opportunity to partner with an outside organization of sorts and have them sponsor memberships in some capacity, or fund scholarships in some capacity? Or is there a way to do different kinds of membership and have a cheaper version with, benefits still, but not as many, to help those that, are in a place where they could really, really benefit from even just a few of the many things that the center has to offer. And I think, if I remember correctly, that's where a lot of people said newsletter would be great, but if I remember correctly, the more in-depth feedback about the newsletter came from Terry, because, they're not members, but it doesn't mean that, you can't still sign up. And maybe that's something worth clarifying in NPMI. If you aren't already a member, we encourage you to join. And if that's not something that is financially feasible for your organization, we invite you to sign up for the following newsletters and provide links as well.
Mhm. Yeah. No, that's great. I was also thinking that, as we do these more within a time frame after they complete the session, whether it's a month after they complete, they get the survey sent to them, we may not always have an awesome intern who can do those follow-up calls. And so we may need to think about which questions that we had reserved for the calls that we would actually want to incorporate into the survey itself. So we get some of that feedback without necessarily having to do the follow-up calls, because I would expect that we would have a higher response rate when we're doing it closer to their end date of their series, and that we may not just have the bandwidth to be able to do the calls. I want to leave us open to being able to do this and do it well and be able to replicate it. But I don't know, just something I'm thinking about. I don't know what you're thinking, Lisa.
Yeah, just a lot of different things in reference to, some good feedback. I wrote a lot of different notes about different stuff. So, but go ahead, what?
I was gonna say, all of this, all of the data, all the feedback, all of everything is can be found in SharePoint under the NPMI folder.
Okay.
Granted, when you read over the Excel spreadsheet of the interview questions and responses, grain of salt for the next couple of days, because I still have to go through and fix typos. It was coherent enough for me to understand and get what I needed and meet my deadline, but I have not had the chance to go back and fix typos and make it prim and proper, if you will. So
All good. No
just
worries.
keep that in mind.
No worries.
So now Dr. Palmer, she'll listen to this. Are you still recording?
I can
Yeah.
stop recording at this
Oh,
point.
it's fine. No, it didn't matter. So we'll discuss some of this feedback, I guess, at the first meeting that we have with her, I guess. Because I was listening to some of the sessions yesterday, and I wrote to jot, I don't know, I guess that'll be the best place to ask some of the questions that I have about some of the sessions and the little there were little mishaps that happened. So that was out of session one. I only got through session one. I guess that'd be the proper place to discuss it when we talk about this thing here.
Yeah, I think so. So what I'll do is I'll send her this recording, and I'll also send her the PowerPoints that you put together, April, so she can have reference to those if she wants to go back and look at them.
And I was gonna say too, just thinking, to the future with the surveys and how to eliminate the necessity for phone calls if there isn't the bandwidth for it. It could be something as simple as, including in the survey saying there's opportunity for more follow-up if you want to share more information, and have those questions. I'm visualizing a separate page in the survey that's follow-up continued, and they're optional, or we make them required and sort of have to weed through it. That can be sorted out, but just an idea. It could be as simple as having an additional thing and leaving it open-ended for them.
That's great. All right, I'm going to stop recording.